in the spring of 1942 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a tenement building that shook when the elevated trains passed, a woman named Martin Scorsese gave birth to her second son, and he arrived already struggling to breathe. The asthma would define his childhood, the way a border defines a country. Everything he would become gathered on one side of that limitation, pressed against it, shaped by what he could not do. He could not play in the streets the way other boys did. He could not run without his chest tightening, without the air turning to something thick and insufficient. And so he stayed inside, in the small apartment on Elizabeth Street, and he watched. What he watched, mostly, were movies. His father, Charles Scorsese, took him. This was not an unusual thing in those years. The movies were where you went, what you did, the dream life of a city that had survived the Depression and sent its sons to war, and was now, in the years after 1945, trying to figure out what peace was supposed to feel like. But for the boy, frail and wheezing, banned from the rough theater of the street, the movies became something else. They became the world he could enter without his body betraying him. His father worked as a clothes presser in the garment district. His mother took in sewing, and on weekends they would take him to the theaters on 42nd Street or in Little Italy, and he would sit in the dark and learn that there were other ways to move through space, other kinds of speed, other laws. He watched everything. Westerns, musicals, melodramas, the Italian films that played in the neighborhood theaters where the dialogue went untranslated because everyone in the audience understood. He watched the way John Ford composed Monument Valley, the way Michael Powell used color like a fever, the way Vincente Minnelli turned a soundstage into a psychological state. He absorbed the grammar of classical Hollywood editing shot, reverse shot, the establishing shot that told you where you were, the close-up that told you what to feel. By the time he was 8 or 9, he had seen more films than most adults see in a lifetime. He could not have articulated what he was learning, but his nervous system was learning it anyway. How to build a sequence, how to control time, how to make violence beautiful and beauty violent. The neighborhood was Elizabeth Street, a few blocks in Lower Manhattan that had been Italian for generations, a place where the language you heard in the hallways was still more Sicilian than English, where the social world was organized around the church and the feast days and the unspoken codes that governed who you spoke to and how. His parents had both been born in America, but their parents had come from Sicily, and the customs and suspicions and elaborate courtesy of that world were still in full force. You did not talk to outsiders. You did not explain yourself. You took care of your own, and you did not ask certain questions about how money was made or why certain men were shown a particular kind of respect. He was small for his age, sickly, bookish in a world that did not value books. His older brother, Frank, was stronger, more naturally suited to the neighborhood's expectations. But Martin, they called him Marty, was different. He spent his time drawing, reading, watching. He was devout in the way that only a Catholic child in an immigrant neighborhood could be devout, which is to say his faith was not a matter of choice or reflection, but simply the air he breathed, the structure that held up the sky. He served as an altar boy at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. He thought, for a time, that he would become a priest. The rituals attracted him, the Latin, the vestments, the choreography of the Mass, which was like a film in its own way, a sequence of gestures that had been refined over centuries until every movement carried weight. But he was also aware, in a way he could not yet name, that there was something else moving underneath the surface of neighborhood life, something glamorous and forbidden. There were men who dressed better than anyone else, who commanded a room just by entering it. There were transactions that happened in whispers, debts that were paid or not paid, respect that was earned in ways the church did not discuss. He was too young to understand organized crime as a concept, but he understood power, and he understood that violence was part of the social fabric, that it was always there, close to the surface, and that it could erupt over a perceived slight or a debt, or simply because someone had decided it was time. He was fascinated, not in the way of a child who wants to grow up to be a gangster. He was never that, but he was fascinated the way an artist is fascinated, by the thing that frightens him, the thing that suggests depths he has not yet mapped. The neighborhood gave him a subject before he knew he needed one. It gave him a world dense with codes and rituals and unspoken hierarchies, a world where honor and betrayal lived in the same gesture, where the sacred and the profane were not opposites, but twins. By the time he was a teenager, the neighborhood was already changing. The post-war years brought urban renewal projects that would eventually erase much of Little Italy, pushing the immigrant poor into housing projects in the outer boroughs or up into the Bronx. But in the 1950s, it was still intact, still a place where you could live your entire life within a few blocks and never need anything the rest of the city had to offer. Except he did need something else. He needed the movies. He went to Cardinal Hayes High School in the Bronx, and then he tried seminary at Cathedral College, but it became clear to him and to his teachers that the priesthood was not where his devotion was taking him. He left after a year. He was 17, unmoored, unsure what shape his life was supposed to take. He enrolled at New York University in Washington Square, which was only a few blocks from Elizabeth Street but might as well have been another country. NYU in the early 1960s was where the children of immigrants went to become something else. Artists, intellectuals, people who read Sartre and argued about Birdman and did not apologize for wanting to make things. He found the film department almost by accident, or maybe it found him. He took a class with Haig Manoogian, a professor who treated film as though it were as serious as literature, who screened Eisenstein and Kurosawa and made his students understand that a cut was a choice, that every frame was a decision, that cinema was not just entertainment, but a language with its own syntax. For the first time, the thing he had been doing all his life, watching movies, became something he could study, take apart, rebuild. He made short films on 16mm, scraping together money from his parents, from part-time jobs, from anywhere he could find it. The films were rough, derivative, overstuffed with ideas he did not yet have the skill to execute, but they were his. One of them, a 9-minute short called What's a Nice Girl Like You Doing in a Place Like This, was about a man obsessed with a photograph on his wall. It was a comedy, more or less, influenced by the French New Wave and the kind of neurotic, self-reflexive humor that was starting to appear in American independent film. It played at a few festivals, won a few minor awards. Another, called It's Not Just You, Murray, was about a small-time hood and his partner, and it was already reaching for the thing that would define his later work, the seductive energy of criminal life, the way it could look like freedom, even as it devoured you. He graduated from NYU in 1964 and stayed on for graduate school, making more shorts, teaching, trying to figure out how you made the leap from student filmmaker to something else. The path was not clear. There was no independent film industry in America in the mid-60s, not the way there would be a decade later. If you wanted to make movies, you went to Hollywood and worked your way up through the studio system, starting as an assistant editor or a script reader and hoping that someday, decades later, they would let you direct a low-budget crime picture or a beach party movie. Or you stayed in New York and made experimental films that screened in basements and museums and were seen by almost no one. He did not want to make experimental films. He loved narrative too much, loved the classical Hollywood grammar he had absorbed as a child. But he also did not want to move to Los Angeles and spend 20 years fetching coffee. So he stayed in New York and tried to find a third path, one that did not yet exist. In 1967, he made his first feature. It was called Who's That Knocking at My Door, and it was about a young Italian-American man, played by an actor named Harvey Keitel, and his relationship with a girl who is not from the neighborhood. The film is suffused with Catholic guilt, sexual confusion, and the codes of a world where women are divided into Madonnas and whores, where love and possession are the same thing, where a man's sense of himself is so fragile that it can be shattered by the admission that his girlfriend was once assaulted. It is not a polished film. The budget was almost non-existent. He shot it over several years whenever he could scrape together money, and there are scenes that feel stagey, unfinished. But there are also moments of startling intimacy. Moments when you can see him learning, in real time, how to turn the techniques he had studied into something that felt alive. The film did not find a distributor right away. It played a few festivals in Europe, where the French critics, always alert to a new voice in American cinema, took notice. But in America, it barely existed. He was 25 years old, living with his parents, teaching at NYU to pay the rent, and he had made a feature film that almost no one would see. It would have been easy to stop there, to decide that the dream was impractical, to go find a job doing something else. But he did not stop. He got hired, almost by accident, to direct a low-budget exploitation film called Boxcar Bertha, produced by Roger Corman, the king of cheap genre pictures. It was 1972. He flew out to Arkansas and spent a few weeks shooting a Depression-era crime picture with Barbara Hershey and David Carradine. The film is minor, professional, forgettable, except for a few moments of crucifixion scene, shot with a lyricism that feels out of place in a drive-in movie that suggests someone working above the material. When it was finished, he showed it to John Cassavetes, the great independent filmmaker, the man who had proved that you could make personal films outside the studio system. Cassavetes watched it, and then told him, more or less, that he had just wasted a year of his life making someone else's movie, and that if he was serious about being a filmmaker, he needed to make something that mattered to him, something that came from the part of his life that no one else could access. It was harsh, but it was also correct, and he knew it. He went back to New York and started writing. Or rather, he started talking because he was never a natural screenwriter. The writing always came hard, and he was always more comfortable talking through an idea than sitting down to type it out. He talked with Martin, a friend from NYU, and together they began shaping a script about the neighborhood, about the young men he had grown up around, about the church and the streets and the way those two worlds existed side by side, each one claiming your soul in its own way. The film would be called Mean Streets, and it would be the first time he made something that felt entirely his own. Mean Streets was shot in 1973, mostly in Los Angeles because it was cheaper, but the few scenes shot in New York, in Little Italy during the Feast of San Gennaro, are the ones that carry the film's emotional truth. It is a film about Charlie, played by Harvey Keitel, a small-time hood trying to navigate the codes of the neighborhood, trying to be a good Catholic and a good criminal at the same time, and discovering that those two things might be incompatible. His friend Johnny Boy, played by a young Robert De Niro, in the performance that would make him a star, is pure, reckless energy, a man who cannot stop self-destructing, who borrows money he cannot pay back and insults people he cannot afford to insult, and seems to be sprinting toward his own annihilation. The film is soaked in Catholic imagery, the statues of the Virgin Mary, the votive candles, the sense that every action is being witnessed and judged by a God who is not interested in excuses. But it is also soaked in rock and roll. The Ronettes, the Rolling Stones, the Marvelettes. The music does not comment on the action. It is the action. It is inside the characters' heads, the soundtrack of their inner lives. The camera moves like it is drunk or in love, pushing in on faces, prowling through the bar where the men gather, leaping from one moment to the next with a restless energy that feels more like memory than storytelling. The film did not make much money, but it was seen. Pauline Kael, the most influential critic in America, championed it. Other filmmakers recognized that something new was happening. And Hollywood, which was in the middle of a strange, uncertain period, trying to figure out how to reach the audience that had grown up on television and rock music and the upheaval of the 60s, started paying attention. This was the moment later called New Hollywood, though no one called it that at the time. It was simply the moment when the studio system, which had collapsed under the weight of bloated musicals and expensive epics, started giving money to young filmmakers who had gone to film school, who had read Cahiers du Cinéma, who thought of themselves as auteurs. Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, William Friedkin, Brian De Palma, and now Scorsese were the directors who were suddenly being handed budgets and told to make something interesting. It would not last, this brief window when the studios did not quite know what they wanted, and so let the inmates run the asylum. But while it lasted, it produced some of the most vital American films ever made. He was offered a project at Columbia Pictures. The script had been kicking around for a few years, written by Paul Schrader, a critic-turned-screenwriter who was just as Catholic and just as tortured as Scorsese himself. It was called Taxi Driver, and it was about a Vietnam veteran named Travis Bickle who drives a cab at night through the streets of New York, watching the city's humanity parade past his windshield and slowly losing his mind. Taxi Driver was shot in the summer of 1975 during a sanitation strike when the garbage piled up on the sidewalks, and the whole city seemed to be rotting from the inside out. The film is drenched in that decay. Travis, played by Robert De Niro, is a man who cannot sleep, who takes the night shift because his insomnia makes day and night meaningless, who writes in his diary that he wants to clean up the streets, to wash away the scum, but who also cannot look away from it, who is drawn to the pornography and the violence and the loneliness, like a man poking at a wound. He becomes obsessed with a young prostitute, played by Jodie Foster, who was 12 years old during the shoot, and with a political campaign worker, played by Sybil Shepherd, who represents everything clean and unreachable in his imagination. The film moves like a fever dream. Bernard Herrmann's score, the last thing he composed before his death, is all ache and dread, a lullaby for a man coming apart. The camera prowls through Times Square, which in 1975 was not yet Disneyfied, was still a zone of peep shows and hustlers and broken neon. Travis buys guns. He practices quick draws in the mirror. He shaves his head into a mohawk and goes to assassinate a political candidate. And when that fails, he goes to rescue the girl, and the film ends in a bloodbath so extreme that the prints had to be desaturated to avoid an X rating, a sequence of violence that is both horrifying and, somehow, cathartic. The film was a hit, not a blockbuster, but a cultural event. It premiered at Cannes and won the Palme d'Or. It made De Niro a star. It turned Scorsese into a name that people outside the film world recognized. And it also made people uneasy. There was something unresolved about Taxi Driver, something that refused to give you a clear moral position to stand on. Was Travis a hero or a monster? The film did not answer. It simply showed you a man disintegrating and let you decide what that meant. He was 33 years old, and he was being offered every project in Hollywood. He could have made anything. He chose to make a musical. New York, New York was an attempt to do for the 1940s what the classical musicals had done, recreate an era on sound stages, using stylized sets and choreographed movement, and the kind of romantic sweep that MGM had perfected. But he wanted to push it further, to show the underside of the romance, the way the music industry chewed people up, the way love and ambition were in constant combat. He cast De Niro and Liza Minnelli, and he gave them a script that was half written and half improvised, and he built elaborate sets and shot in long takes, letting the actors find the scenes as they went. It was a disaster. Not artistically. There are sequences in New York, New York that are as good as anything he ever made, but commercially and personally. The film went over budget and over schedule. It was released in the summer of 1977, the same summer as Star Wars, and audiences who were lining up to see spaceships had no interest in a downbeat musical about a self-destructive jazz musician. The reviews were mixed. The film lost money, and Scorsese, who had been using cocaine to keep up with the impossible pace of the production, found that the drug had stopped being a tool and become a necessity, and then a problem, and then something worse. The next few years are hard to narrate cleanly because they were not lived cleanly. He was living in Los Angeles, which he had never liked, in a house in the Hollywood Hills, and he was using cocaine every day, and he was falling apart. His marriage to the writer Julia Cameron was disintegrating. He was editing a documentary about the band's final concert called The Last Waltz and pouring himself into that project as though it were a lifeboat, because in some ways it was the only thing keeping him connected to the work. He was supposed to be making another film, something smaller and more personal, but he could not get it together. And then, in the late summer of 1978, he ended up in a hospital. The details vary depending on who is telling the story, but the broad strokes are consistent. He had pushed his body past the point where it could continue, and it simply stopped. He was hospitalized for exhaustion, for internal bleeding, for the accumulated damage of months of abuse. He thought, for a time, that he might die, and in the hospital, Robert De Niro came to visit him and brought a book. The book was Raging Bull, the autobiography of Jake LaMotta, a middleweight boxer from the Bronx, who had been famous in the 1940s and 50s, and who had destroyed himself through jealousy and violence and a self-loathing so deep it seemed almost metaphysical. De Niro had been trying to get Scorsese interested in the project for years, but Scorsese had resisted. He did not like sports, did not care about boxing. But now, lying in a hospital bed, he read it again, and this time he saw something else. He saw a man at war with himself. He saw a man who needed to be punished, and so punished everyone around him until someone punished him back. He saw, in other words, a character study that was also a religious parable, a film about a man who could only find grace through obliteration. He agreed to make it, and in making it, he pulled himself back from the edge. Raging Bull was shot in 1979, in black and white. A decision that was both practical color would have made the blood look too garish and aesthetic. He wanted it to look like the boxing films and tabloid photographs of the 1940s, wanted it to feel like a memory, like something already lost. De Niro, who had been training for months, gained 60 pounds for the later scenes, transforming his body so completely that it is difficult to believe the sleek fighter in the early sequences and the bloated nightclub owner in the later ones are the same person. The film is structured like a rise and fall, but it is not interested in making you like Jake LaMotta. He is jealous, paranoid, inarticulate except with his fists. He beats his opponents in the ring, and he beats his wife at home, and the film does not flinch from showing you that he is, in most conventional senses, a bad man. But it also shows you the pain underneath the violence, the way he seems to be begging the world to destroy him, the way his self-loathing finds expression in his fists. The boxing sequences are some of the most visceral ever filmed, slow motion and regular speed intercut. The sound design mixing the animal grunts of the fighters with the flashbulbs in the crowd, the ropes creaking, the blood spattering the canvas. It is both beautiful and unbearable. The film ends with Jake alone in a dressing room, reciting the "I could have been a contender" speech from On the Waterfront to his reflection in the mirror, a man who has lost everything and gained something he cannot name. The final title card is a quote from the Gospel of John, "Once I was blind, but now I can see." It is not clear if Jake has achieved grace or simply survived long enough to look back and see the wreckage. The film does not say. Raging Bull opened in November of 1980, and the reviews were extraordinary. It was immediately called a masterpiece. Critics compared it to the great films of the silent era, to Eisenstein and Murnau. It won 2 Oscars, for De Niro and for the editing by Thelma Schoonmaker, who had been Scorsese's editor since the early days and who understood his rhythms better than anyone. But Scorsese himself did not win for Best Director, losing to Robert Redford for Ordinary People, and the film did not win Best Picture. It was a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 25 years. He was sober now, and he was back in New York. The Hollywood Hills phase was over. He returned to the city that had always been his subject, and he tried to figure out what came next. He made The King of Comedy, a dark satire about celebrity and obsession, with De Niro as a delusional aspiring comedian who kidnaps a talk show host played by Jerry Lewis. It is one of the most uncomfortable films he ever made, and it was largely ignored on release. He made After Hours, a screwball nightmare about a man trapped in downtown Manhattan overnight, and it was a return to form, a smaller film that felt loose and playful and strange. But he was also drifting. The energy of New Hollywood was gone. The studios, chastened by a series of expensive failures, were no longer interested in giving money to difficult personal films by directors who thought of themselves as artists. The new model was the blockbuster Star Wars, Jaws, Raiders of the Lost Ark films that could be turned into franchises, that could sell toys and lunchboxes. There was still room for serious filmmaking, but it was a smaller room, and the budgets were tighter and the leash was shorter. He wanted to make a film about Jesus Christ. This was not a new idea. He had been thinking about it since the late 1970s, when he read a novel by Nikos Kazantzakis called The Last Temptation of Christ, which imagined Jesus as fully human, tempted not just by power, but by the ordinary pleasures of life, marriage, children, growing old. For a man whose entire career had been an exploration of Catholic guilt, the idea of making a film about Christ's humanity, about the struggle between the flesh and the spirit, was irresistible. But it was also, obviously, going to be controversial. The Last Temptation of Christ was shot in Morocco in 1987 on a small budget with a cast that included Willem Dafoe as Jesus and Harvey Keitel as Judas. The film imagines the crucifixion not as a foregone conclusion, but as a choice that Jesus makes, over and over, against the temptation to be something else: a husband, a father, an ordinary man. The final sequence, in which Jesus on the cross is offered a vision of that other life, is both heartbreaking and theologically radical, because it suggests that the sacrifice only has meaning if the thing being sacrificed is genuinely desirable. The film was protested before it was released. Religious groups, many of whom had not seen it, accused it of blasphemy. There were bomb threats at theaters. The reaction was so intense that some theaters refused to screen it. But the film was also defended by critics and theologians who recognized that it was not an attack on Christianity, but a deep, sincere engagement with the central mystery of the faith, the idea that God became man, and that in becoming man he took on all the weight and weakness and longing that come with having a body. It is one of his most personal films, and also one of his least seen. The controversy obscured the film itself, which is quiet, meditative, more interested in questions than answers. But for those who did see it, it was clear that this was a filmmaker still willing to risk everything to make the film he believed in, even if it meant stepping into the fire. The 1990s began with Goodfellas, and Goodfellas is where everything he had been learning for 30 years came together into something that looked effortless. The film is based on the true story of Henry Hill, a low-level mobster who grew up idolizing the gangsters in his Brooklyn neighborhood and spent his adult life working for the Lucchese crime family before eventually becoming an informant. The script, written with Nicholas Pileggi, is based on Pileggi's book Wise Guy, and it follows Henry from his teenage years through his rise in the organization, his marriage, his involvement in drug dealing, and his eventual betrayal of everyone he knew. But the film is not interested in making a moral case. It does not pause to explain that crime is bad or that these men are parasites. Instead, it pulls you inside Henry's point of view and shows you why he made the choices he made, why the mob looked like the most attractive option in the world when you were a kid in East New York watching the men in the social club get treated like royalty. The film's most famous sequence, a long tracking shot that follows Henry and his girlfriend Karen through the back entrance of the Copacabana nightclub, past the kitchen, through the corridors, and into the main room where a table materializes for them in front of the stage, is a perfect distillation of the seduction at the film's core. This is what it feels like to be connected, to be somebody, to have the world rearrange itself around you. The film is structured around two voiceovers, Henry's and Karen's, and their voices guide you through the story with an intimacy that makes you complicit. You are not watching these people from a distance. You are inside their heads. The camera is constantly moving, pushing in, circling, cutting between moments with a rhythm that feels like a jazz solo, loose and precise at the same time. The soundtrack is a wall-to-wall jukebox, dozens of songs from the 1950s through the 70s, each one landing like a memory, each one telling you what the scene feels like from the inside. When Henry and his crew are at the height of their power, the music is exuberant Derek and the Dominoes, Aretha Franklin, and when it all starts to fall apart, when Henry is strung out on cocaine and the helicopters are following him, the music becomes paranoid and jagged. Harry Nilsson and Muddy Waters and the Rolling Stones, the soundtrack of a man who knows the walls are closing in. The violence in the film is sudden and casual. Men are killed in the middle of conversations, and the camera does not linger. A body is discovered in a dumpster, and the scene plays almost as a punchline. This is the world these men live in, where murder is a business decision, where loyalty lasts exactly as long as it is useful. And yet the film also shows you the domestic side of this life, the meals, the parties, the elaborate performances of family and friendship that exist alongside the brutality. The mob, as Goodfellas presents it, is not an alternative to mainstream society, but a distorted mirror of it, a place where the values of ambition and loyalty and success are pushed to their most extreme and destructive form. The film ends with Henry in witness protection, living in suburban anonymity, mourning the loss of his old life, even though that life was killing him. "I'm an average nobody," he says. "I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook." It is not presented as a happy ending. The film has spent 2.5 hours showing you the seductive energy of that world, and even though you have also seen the bodies and the betrayals, even though you know that everyone in that life either ends up dead or in prison, there is a part of you and a part of Henry that still misses it. Goodfellas was released in September of 1990, and it was immediately recognized as something special. The reviews were ecstatic. It was nominated for 6 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. It did not win. Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves won Best Picture, and Costner won Best Director, and there is a sense in which that outcome summarizes the Academy's relationship to Scorsese. For most of his career, they respected him, they nominated him, and then they gave the prize to someone else. But Goodfellas had a life beyond the Oscars. It became a cultural touchstone, endlessly quoted, endlessly referenced. It influenced everything that came after. Crime films, television shows, the entire grammar of how you tell a story about people doing bad things without turning them into cartoons. It is the film that proved you could make the audience fall in love with characters who were, by any reasonable measure, monsters, and that you could do it without lying about what they were. It is the film that, in many ways, defines him. Not because it is necessarily his best film, that is an argument people will have forever, but because it is the purest distillation of his strengths. The kinetic camera, the wall-to-wall music, the voiceover that pulls you inside the subjective experience, the refusal to moralize, the way the film is both a critique and a celebration, the way it loves its characters and knows they are doomed. Everything he had been working towards since Mean Streets is fully present in Goodfellas, and it looks easy, which means it is the result of decades of practice. After Goodfellas, he remade Cape Fear, a glossy thriller that was unlike anything he had made before, a genre exercise that let him play with the tools of suspense filmmaking without the weight of personal history. It was a hit, and it bought him the freedom to make something else, something more ambitious. That film was The Age of Innocence, an adaptation of Edith Wharton's novel about old New York society in the 1870s, a world of rigid codes and suppressed desires, and drawing rooms where the battles were fought with glances and insinuations. It was, on the surface, the opposite of Goodfellas. No violence, no crime, no working-class rage. But it was also about a closed world with its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own punishments for those who stepped out of line. And it was about a man, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, who wants something he cannot have, and who spends his life learning to live with that absence. The film is one of his most controlled, most elegant. Every frame is composed like a painting, every gesture weighted with meaning. It is also, in its quiet way, one of his saddest. The violence in his films is usually literal fists, guns, blood, but in the age of innocence, the violence is done to the self, to the soul, to the possibility of happiness. It is a film about renunciation, and it is beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. He spent the next decade making films that were all, in one way or another, about American history and the violence that built it. Casino in 1995 was a return to mob territory, a sprawling epic about Las Vegas in the 70s and 80s, about the moment when the gangsters who had built the city were pushed out by corporations and accountants. It is longer and colder than Goodfellas, less interested in seduction and more interested in showing you the machinery of power, the way money moves, the way violence is used to enforce contracts that cannot be written down. De Niro and Joe Pesci, who had been so electric in Goodfellas, are reunited, and the film is structured around the slow unraveling of their partnership, a friendship that curdles into resentment and finally murder. Kundun, in 1997, was a film about the early life of the Dalai Lama, a spiritual biography that is as much about Buddhism as The Last Temptation was about Christianity. It is quiet, contemplative, the least violent film he ever made, and it was largely ignored by American audiences, though it was championed by a small group of admirers who saw in it a different side of his work, a stillness that had always been there underneath the speed. Bringing Out the Dead in 1999 was a return to New York and to Paul Schrader, who wrote the script. It is a film about a paramedic, played by Nicolas Cage, working the night shift in Hell's Kitchen, a man who has seen too much death and is being haunted by the people he could not save. It is Taxi Driver again, essentially, but softer, more mournful. The city has changed. This is New York in the middle of its transformation into something cleaner, safer, less dangerous, but the loneliness is the same. And then came Gangs of New York, which took years to get made and which felt, in some ways, like the culmination of everything he had been thinking about since childhood. It is set in the mid-19th century in the Five Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, a place of immigrant gangs and brutal violence and a kind of tribal warfare that prefigured the organized crime of the 20th century. It is a film about how America was built, about the violence and nativism and corruption that are part of the foundation, and it is also a film about spectacle, about Howard Hawks and John Ford and the grand tradition of American historical epics. The film is sprawling, overstuffed, uneven. There are sequences of astonishing power: the opening battle, shot in a swirling fog, the draft riots, which turn into an inferno. And there are sequences that feel inert, weighted down by exposition. Daniel Day-Lewis, as Bill the Butcher, gives a performance of such feral intensity that he threatens to unbalance the film, to turn it into a one-man show. But the film is also deeply felt, a genuine attempt to reckon with the city that made him, to trace the roots of the violence he had been filming his entire career. It was released in December of 2002, and it was nominated for 10 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. It did not win. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most respected American filmmaker of his generation. His films were studied in universities, screened in retrospectives, analyzed frame by frame. And yet the Academy, which was supposed to represent the industry's judgment of itself, kept passing him over. He had been nominated for Best Director 7 times and had never won. It was becoming something beyond bad luck, becoming a kind of running joke, and also a source of genuine frustration for those who believed that his work deserved the recognition. In 2006, he made The Departed, a remake of a Hong Kong crime film called Infernal Affairs, about undercover cops and undercover criminals, and the way identity becomes slippery when you spend too long pretending to be someone else. It was set in Boston, and it starred Leonardo DiCaprio and Matt Damon and Jack Nicholson, and it was fast and brutal and entertaining in a way that some of his more ambitious films were not. It was, in other words, a crowd pleaser, but a smart one. A genre film made by someone who understood genre from the inside out. The film was a hit, both commercially and critically. And when the Oscar nominations were announced, it was clear that this was finally going to be his year. The Academy, perhaps embarrassed by the years of snubs, perhaps genuinely moved by the film, gave The Departed Best Picture and gave Scorsese Best Director. He was 64 years old. He had been making films for 40 years. And when his name was called, and he walked to the stage, and he gave a gracious speech thanking everyone who had supported him over the decades, there was a sense that a wrong had been righted, that the system had finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. But there was also something bittersweet about it. The Departed is a good film, a solid film, but it is not Taxi Driver, it is not Raging Bull, it is not Goodfellas. The Academy had given him the Oscar, but they had given it to him for the wrong film, or at least not the best film. It felt like a Lifetime Achievement Award disguised as a competitive prize, and while it was gratifying, it also underscored the fact that the films he had made in the 70s and 80s, the films that had redefined American cinema, had been passed over in their time. He kept working. He made Shutter Island, a psychological thriller set in a mental hospital in the 1950s, and it was pulpy and atmospheric and enormously successful. He made Hugo, a family film about the early days of cinema, about Georges Méliès and the magic of movies, and it was the most openly sentimental thing he had ever made. A love letter to the medium that had saved his life when he was a sickly child in Little Italy. It was shot in 3 dimensions, a technology he had never used before, and he embraced it with the enthusiasm of someone half his age, using it not as a gimmick, but as a way to deepen the space, to make the past feel tactile. He made The Wolf of Wall Street, and it was Goodfellas again, essentially, but set on Wall Street in the 1990s, about a stockbroker named Jordan Belfort who stole hundreds of millions of dollars and lived like a Roman emperor until the FBI caught him. The film is 3 hours long, and it is relentless, a hurricane of excess drugs, sex, money, shouting, the camera whipping around like it is as high as the characters. Leonardo DiCaprio, who had become his primary collaborator in the years since Gangs of New York, plays Belfort as a man who has no off switch, who treats life as a performance and the audience as suckers. The film was accused, by some critics, of glorifying its subject, of wallowing in the excess without condemning it, but that was the point. The film is structured exactly like Goodfellas. It pulls you inside the subjective experience, makes you complicit, shows you why this looked like freedom, and then it ends with Belfort barely punished, selling his story, still performing. The film is not a morality tale. It is a portrait of a culture that rewards people like Belfort, that turns them into celebrities, that lets them walk away rich. He made Silence, a passion project he had been trying to make for decades, an adaptation of Shusaku Endo's novel about Jesuit missionaries in 17th century Japan, about faith and doubt and the silence of God in the face of suffering. It is a long, difficult, beautifully made film, and it was largely ignored on release, though it will likely be rediscovered in the years to come by those who recognize it as one of his most sustained meditations on belief. He made The Irishman, a 3.5-hour epic about a mob hitman named Frank Sheeran and his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa, and it was, in many ways, a final reckoning with the world he had been filming since Mean Streets. De Niro, Pesci, and Al Pacino, the actors who defined his career, were all in it, and they were old now. Their faces digitally altered in the early scenes to make them look younger, and the effect was strange and ghostly, a reminder that time was the one thing even these men could not outrun. The film is slower than his earlier mob films, more elegiac. The violence, when it comes, is not exhilarating. It is tired, sad, the work of men who have been doing this too long. The film ends with Frank alone in a nursing home, abandoned by everyone, the door to his room left slightly ajar, in a final image that is almost unbearably lonely. The Irishman was released by Netflix, which meant it played in a handful of theaters for a few weeks and then lived on a streaming service. And there was something melancholy about that too, this grand summation of a career, this 3.5-hour meditation on violence and regret and the cost of loyalty, available to watch on a phone. His most recent film, Killers of the Flower Moon, is about the Osage murders in Oklahoma in the 1920s, when members of the Osage Nation, who had become wealthy from oil deposits on their land, were systematically killed by white settlers who wanted their money. It is a film about greed and racism and the foundational violence of America, and it is also, surprisingly, a love story, or at least the story of a marriage, between a white man, played by DiCaprio, who marries an Osage woman, played by Lily Gladstone, and slowly poisons her for her inheritance. It is one of the most morally complex films he has made, because it does not let you off the hook by making the villain a monster. DiCaprio's character is weak, easily led, capable of tenderness and murder in the same breath. And the film asks you to sit with that contradiction, to understand how a man can love someone and kill them at the same time. The film is long, patient, and visually ravishing. The Oklahoma landscape is shot in a golden, elegiac light, and the images have a weight to them, a sense of history pressing down on every frame. It is a film made by someone in his 80s, someone who has spent a lifetime thinking about violence and guilt and the way history is written by those who survive it. He is 82 now. He shows no signs of stopping. There are more projects in development, more scripts being written, more films he wants to make. But there is also a sense, watching his recent work, that he is thinking about endings, about what remains when the noise stops, about the silence that comes after. The central tension in his work has always been between the world and the soul, between the seductive energy of violence and ambition and the quieter, more painful knowledge that none of it saves you. His characters are men, almost always men who want something so badly that they destroy themselves and everyone around them in pursuit of it, and then, if they survive, they have to live with what they have done. Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Henry Hill, Frank Sheeran. They are all versions of the same person, a man at war with himself, a man who cannot reconcile the flesh and the spirit, who cannot figure out how to live in the world without being consumed by it. And yet he is also the preserver, the man who has spent decades working to save films from decay, to restore the classics, to make sure that the history of cinema does not disappear. The Film Foundation, which he founded in 1990, has restored hundreds of films, many of them obscure, many of them from countries and eras that would otherwise have been forgotten. He gives interviews where he talks about the films he loves with the enthusiasm of a teenager, where he lists the directors who influenced him, where he makes the case over and over that cinema is an art form worth taking seriously. He is, in this sense, a man who has devoted his life to the movies in a way that goes beyond making them, who understands that being a filmmaker means being part of a tradition, part of a conversation that stretches back to the Lumiere brothers and forward into a future he will not live to see. There is something moving about this, the way he holds both things at once, the violence and the preservation, the films that show people destroying themselves, and the work to make sure that those films survive. It is as though he understands that the impulse to create and the impulse to save are two sides of the same devotion, that both are acts of faith in the possibility that what we make will matter, will endure, will speak to someone we will never meet. He has said in interviews that he does not know how to do anything else, that making films is the only thing he knows, the only language he is fluent in. And watching his career unfold over 6 decades, it is clear that this is true. He is not someone who could retire, who could walk away from the work and find satisfaction in something quieter. The work is the life. The films are the autobiography, even when they are about gangsters or boxers or missionaries in Japan. Every frame is a decision. Every cut is a choice. And those choices, accumulated over a lifetime, form a portrait of a mind, a sensibility, a way of seeing the world. The question of influence is complicated because his influence is everywhere. Every crime film made in the last 30 years is in conversation with Goodfellas, whether it knows it or not. Every filmmaker who uses pop music as a narrative tool, who builds a sequence around the energy of a song, is following a path he helped carve. The handheld camera, the long tracking shot, the voiceover that does not explain but complicates, these are all part of the vocabulary now, so integrated into the language of cinema that it is easy to forget they were once innovations, choices that felt risky and strange. But his influence goes deeper than technique. He proved that you could make films that were both popular and personal, that you did not have to choose between art and entertainment, that a film could be a thriller and a meditation, a genre exercise and a confession. He proved that American cinema could be as formally ambitious as anything coming out of Europe, that you could love Howard Hawks and Jean-Luc Godard, that you could revere the past and blow it apart at the same time. He also, perhaps more than any other filmmaker of his generation, made it possible to take film seriously as an art form in America. Before the 1970s, film criticism existed, film scholarship existed, but it was still a marginal pursuit, something that happened in universities and niche magazines. Scorsese, along with Coppola and a few others, helped shift that, helped make it possible to talk about movies the way people talked about novels or paintings, as objects worthy of sustained attention, of interpretation, of care. And yet, for all the influence, for all the accolades, there is something solitary about him. He is not a figure who built a school or gathered disciples. His collaborators, Thelma Schoonmaker, Michael Chapman, Robert Richardson, the screenwriters and actors he has worked with over the years, speak of him with admiration and affection, but also as someone who is, in the end, alone with the work, someone who cannot quite explain what he is looking for until he sees it. He is not a theorist. He is not someone who can articulate a philosophy of cinema in neat, quotable terms. He works by instinct, by feel, by an accumulated knowledge that is closer to muscle memory than intellect. The films themselves are his theory, and what they argue over and over is that cinema is a form of witness, a way of paying attention to the world and the people in it, with a focus and intensity that ordinary life does not allow. His camera does not judge his characters, but it does not let them off the hook either. It watches them closely, and it asks you to watch too, to sit with their choices and their failures and the consequences that unfold from them. There is a late scene in The Irishman, after Frank has testified against his friends, after everyone he knew is dead or disappeared, when he is sitting in the nursing home and a priest comes to visit him. The priest asks if he wants to confess, if he is sorry for the things he has done. And Frank says more or less that he is not. Or maybe he is, but he does not have the words for it. The priest leaves, and Frank is alone again, and the camera holds on his face, and what you see there is not redemption but simply endurance, the grim fact of still being alive when everyone else is gone. It is a quintessentially Scorsese moment. No easy grace, no last-minute salvation, just a man sitting with the weight of his choices, unable to undo them, unable to explain them, and the film offering no comfort except the acknowledgement that this is what it looks like, this is what remains. His films have always been about men who cannot escape themselves, who are trapped inside their own desires and failures and the worlds they have made. And the films do not offer escape either. They pull you inside, they make you complicit, they ask you to feel the seductive pull of the violence and the ambition, and then they leave you there, without a map, without a moral to take home. It is not comfortable, but it is honest. And it is, in its own way, a form of respect for the audience's intelligence, respect for the complexity of human behavior, respect for the idea that art does not have to provide answers, that sometimes it is enough to ask the right questions, and ask them with enough intensity that they linger long after the screen goes dark. He has lived long enough to see his early films become classics, to see Taxi Driver and Raging Bull taught in film schools, analyzed in essays, referenced in other films. He has lived long enough to see the neighborhood he grew up in, largely erased, turned into expensive real estate for people who have no memory of what it used to be. He has lived long enough to see the industry change completely, to see the studios consolidated, the mid-budget film all but disappear, the theatrical experience threatened by streaming and algorithms and the sheer overwhelming noise of contemporary life. And yet he keeps making films, not because he has to prove anything, he proved it decades ago, but because the work is the point, because there are still stories he wants to tell, still images he wants to capture, still questions he wants to ask, because making films is how he thinks, how he processes the world, how he makes sense of the chaos. There is a scene in Hugo, the family film about early cinema, where the children discover a cache of old films in the attic, and they hold the strips of celluloid up to the light, and the images flicker to life, and it is like magic, like resurrection. The film is about a magician who becomes a filmmaker, and then loses his faith, and then finds it again through the love of people who remember his work. It is, not coincidentally, about Scorsese himself, about the boy who sat in the dark theaters of Little Italy and learned that movies could save you, could give you a life you would not have otherwise had. He has said that movies saved his life, and it is not hyperbole. Without them, he would have been another sickly kid in the neighborhood maybe, or he would have found some other path. But movies gave him a language, a way to channel everything he felt, the devotion and the rage and the guilt and the love, into something that could be shared, that could be witnessed, that could endure. His legacy is the films, obviously. Taxi Driver will be watched as long as people watch films. Raging Bull will be studied as long as people study films. Goodfellas will be quoted and referenced and imitated for generations. But his legacy is also the broader argument he has spent his life making, that cinema matters, that it is not a disposable entertainment, but a form of art capable of beauty and complexity and truth, that it deserves to be taken seriously, preserved, respected. He is, in the end, a man who has devoted his life to a medium that is, in some ways, dying. The theaters are emptier, the attention span shorter, the competition for eyeballs more intense. The language he speaks long takes, patient storytelling, the slow accumulation of mood and detail is not the language that dominates contemporary cinema, which is faster, louder, more fragmented. But he continues to speak it because it is the only language he has, and because he believes, with a faith that is almost religious, that it still matters. There is a moment near the end of Silence, the film about the Jesuit missionaries, when the main character, after being tortured and broken, finally renounces his faith to save the lives of others. He steps on an image of Christ, the ultimate apostasy, and the film asks whether this is a sin or an act of love, whether God is silent because he is absent or because his presence is too vast to be comprehended. The film does not answer. It simply holds the question the way all his films hold their questions, with a patience that is almost painful. And maybe that is the final word on his work, that it is patient, that it refuses easy answers, that it trusts the audience to sit with complexity and ambiguity and the uncomfortable truth that people are capable of terrible things, and also of love, that the world is beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and that cinema, at its best, can show you both at once, can hold them in the frame together and let you decide what that means. He is still working, still thinking, still watching films. He will make more if his health allows, if the money can be found, if the stories come. And when he is gone, the films will remain, a body of work that spans more than half a century, that documents not just his life, but the life of the city that made him, the industry that he helped transform, the medium he devoted himself to, with a completeness that few artists of any kind ever achieve. The camera is still running, the work continues, and somewhere, in a theater or on a screen, the images flicker to life, and the story begins again.